Good morning. I'm Jaclyn Moyer, the author of On Gold Hill. Thank you all for coming out. It's really an honor to be able to share a little bit about my book and also to share the stage with such eloquent and inspiring other writers. It's been really exciting to think about On Gold Hill in the context of a first-year experience program because so many of the questions that I explore in the book really began to bubble up for me in my own years as an undergraduate at the University of California, Santa Cruz. What I remember most about that time is the hunger that I felt to find out who I was and what my place in the world might be. It was a question I found both thrilling and bewildering, and one that for me had as much to do with pondering possible futures as it did with wondering about my past and the people and places I came from. My mother was born in northern India. In 1971, she moved to California, to Los Angeles with her family. She was 15, and like many other young immigrants, she adapted quickly to life in America. She finished high school, won a scholarship to UCLA. Soon she met a young man who was a white hippie, who wore his hair long, strummed out Neil Young songs for her on his guitar, and didn't know not to ask an Indian girl out on a date. Her parents expected my mother, who was their eldest daughter, to have an arranged marriage, and they forbid the relationship. But she married him anyway. Then they moved to a rural community in northeastern California to raise two American daughters in the oak-studded Sierra foothills. My mother didn't give my sister and I Indian names. She didn't teach us Punjabi. She hardly talked at all about her past. Growing up, I couldn't have told you what part of Punjab my family was from, what their lives had been like there, or why they had left that place for America. Occasionally, I did catch a glimpse of the life my mother had lived before California. The few times each month she cooked a Punjabi meal for us, or when I was sick and instead of making chicken soup, she fed us hot ginger broth that stained the bowl bright orange with turmeric. Mostly my windows into this past came through visits with my grandparents. I'd watch my grandmother gracefully drape a chunni over her head, peel ginger with the back of a knife, or mix flour and water into dough for the pranta and roti, the flatbreads she made each day for breakfast. I longed to know how to do these things myself, to understand who my grandmother was and where we had come from. I felt the absence of this cultural heritage like a phantom limb, a feeling that stayed with me throughout my childhood and into adulthood, and as I left the Sierra foothills to Santa Cruz for college. At UCSC, I took classes with names like Globalization and Its Discontents or Nature, Poverty, and Progress. I was engaged and excited by the ideas that I was exposed to in these classes, but like so many young people then and now, the more I learned, the more deeply overwhelmed I felt by the scale of the problems exposed to me. Biodiversity loss, wealth disparity, environmental collapse. I memorized the definitions of economic terms like neoliberalism or accumulation by dispossession, wrote essays about historical events, but I couldn't see where I fit in among all this. Couldn't imagine how my own life related to forces that felt so big and abstract at the time, beyond my ability to engage with or really play any meaningful role in. In college, I also felt a new discomfort with my tenuous relationship to my heritage. Here, for the first time, I encountered affinity groups for South Asians, people asking how I identified. Was I brown, white, Indian, Punjabi, Desi, half Indian, multiracial, bicultural? Did I identify as a first-generation immigrant? Was I a descendant of colonized people or colonizers, part of a diaspora? I didn't know how to answer any of these questions or where I belonged in all of this. It was also during those years at UCSC that I first encountered the alternative food movement in the world of organic farming. So many of the environmental catastrophes and social injustices I studied had roots in the industrial food system, and organic farming, it seemed to me, offered a means to take action against all of this, a kind of antidote to the feeling of personal powerlessness I felt in the face of so much wreckage. I began working in farms and gardens, and when I was 25, returned to my hometown to start my own organic vegetable farm. I didn't expect this endeavor would have much at all to do with my longing to connect with my heritage, but one day, that first summer on the farm, a friend of mine who was a baker brought me a loaf of bread made with a grain I'd never heard of, Sonora wheat. Sonora was one of the first wheats ever grown on the North American continent, It had once been common in the grain fields of California until the 1950s when high-yielding wheat drove it out of production. But now, my friend told me, artisan bakers were looking for heirloom grains and they were interested in Sonora. He thought maybe we should grow some. I was intrigued, though not entirely sold. My partner and I were vegetable farmers and we didn't have much experience with grains. I began to do a little research into what it might involve when I stumbled upon an unexpected detail. This variety had also once been a prominent landrace grown in the region of Punjab where my mother was from. The flour it produced was neither hard like a bread flour or soft like a pastry flour, and it was perfect for roti and pranta, the traditional flatbread of the region, and those that my grandmother made every day. There were plenty of compelling reasons to grow Sonora, but it was, of course, the link between this wheat's history and my own that I found irresistible. If I could grow this grain, if I could plant the seed, harvest a crop, mill flour from the kernels, I wondered, might I reclaim a piece of the inheritance I'd lost? I planted a field of Sonora that first fall and grew it for the next 3 years. In the course of learning to cultivate the wheat, I began to talk with my grandmother about her past. The wheat served as a kind of key, opening a door to conversations I'd never before known how to enter. I'd ask a simple question: do you remember the color of the grains of wheat in your childhood village? She'd begin to describe how she walked past wheat fields on her way to school each morning, how she'd hunt for peacock feathers amid the stalks, and how, after she was engaged to be married at 9, she stopped walking there, stopped going to school at all. Then she'd be telling me of her wedding at 16, the birth of my mother a year later. She described the fear she felt to accept this fate, how young and unprepared she had been, how she hadn't wanted a child, an unlucky girl child no less. How on the night that she'd given birth, a tray of coals had been set beneath the bed to ward off the cold, how a corner of the bedsheet had fallen in unnoticed and begun to smolder, and how when the baby, my mother, at last slipped loose of her body, the bed erupted in flame. Because I hardly spoke any Punjabi and my grandmother's English was scarce, we had these conversations through the translation of my mother. What did not occur to me then, though it should have been obvious, is that my mother herself had never heard any of the stories that my grandmother told me. They were stories never before told. And so it was through my mother's translation that we both learned for the first time the story of my grandmother's experience of partition, how she and her family had walked for weeks, along with millions of others, to cross the new line from Pakistan to India. She described the horrors she'd witnessed on that journey, how her family had left all their belongings behind, and how, when at last they reached their ancestral village, the first thing they came to own there was a sack of wheat berries. My partner and I farmed on Gold Hill for 4 years, and over those many seasons, I experienced the most severe drought in California's recorded history, traveled to my family's village in Punjab, gave birth to a daughter. In turn, I learned a lot about wheat cultivation, about organic farming, and my own family history. But I left the farm with far more questions than answers, less certain than ever of what constituted my heritage and what it might mean to reclaim it, of why I'd wanted to become an organic farmer and how that conviction had unraveled, and what Sonora wheat had to do with any of it. What I was certain of was that it did, in fact, have something to do with it. I felt like I had half the pieces of a puzzle, enough to see that they were part of a larger picture, but not enough to see what that picture might reveal. So I began what became an 8-year endeavor to find the rest of those pieces. I looked both within myself, writing into the places I felt most conflicted, unearthing memories and prying forth words to articulate the particular shapes of my longings and disappointments. And I looked outside myself. I pored over books on the history of Punjab under colonialism, on early wheat breeding efforts and the origins of the organic farming movement. I dug into archives, conducted more interviews with my grandparents, talked with other farmers. When I began to put together a manuscript and show it to early readers, some suggested perhaps I should stick to a more straightforward memoir. Or maybe I was writing 2 books, one about organic farming and the bifurcation of the food system, and one about my own story and my family history. I worried, too, that I didn't have the right credentials to write about complicated geopolitical histories, the Green Revolution or the Cold War. I was no agronomist, no political scientist. I didn't have a PhD in anything, wasn't an expert of any kind. But the more I researched and the more I wrote, the more deeply intertwined I found the 3 threads of history I explored to be: my own past, the organic farming movement, and the history of wheat cultivation. And the more convinced I became that these were not separate narratives, but part of the same story, my story. To truly understand who I was and where I came from, I needed to follow both the personal and the societal. I could no longer see the details of my life story, of my grandmothers, my cousins in India, or my neighbors on Gold Hill as independent from these broader forces. I could no longer describe my own experiences of the way it felt to pull a bell bean from the soil and see the nitrogen-fixing bacteria on the roots without thinking of the British botanist Sir Albert Howard, later deemed the father of organic farming, striding through the wheat fields of my grandparents' village in Punjab, tasked with the job of improving crop yields for the empire. In turn, what had once felt to me as removed, abstract ideas, theories learned about in undergrad, began to take on tangible, embodied form. This is what had been missing for me as a college student studying food systems, the fleshed out, living, breathing, human-scale story of the ways political and economic histories wove through the lives of regular people I knew, of my own life. I wanted to write a book that placed these things side by side, the deeply personal and the global, the granular and the sweeping. I sought a way of understanding who I was that included science and scholarship alongside the stories of my family and my own experiences. People like my grandmother were not included in the history books I read, and I wanted to put her voice, her lilting, part Punjabi, part English sentences on the page right next to the booming words of Norman Borlaug accepting his Nobel Peace Prize for his work breeding wheat. I wanted to describe Alice Waters' famous cafe in Berkeley, where the word organic first appeared on a menu, and put this scene right alongside one of my grandmother 5 hours south in an overcrowded apartment, deftly rolling out paper-thin circles of dough for roti. I wanted to map my own very personal experience of failing to earn a living as a small farmer on rented land, atop the long history of farm worker exploitation in California. Through this process, I began to see my own life story as part of a larger story, woven into the fabric of a history that belongs to all of us, and one that, as humans alive today, we all belong. Every seed, a kernel of wheat, or the pit of a peach is a kind of story, a living memory of the ecological, cultural, and political histories that shaped it into being. It's also true that a story can be a kind of seed. For me, On Gold Hill is the yield of many years spent pursuing a certain set of inquiries. But like all seeds, it has been both a culmination and a starting point, a foundation of self-understanding that has informed and deepened my desire to understand the people and histories and landscapes that make up our world. My biggest hope for this book is that it might be a seed not only for myself, but for my readers, a seed of curiosity or inspiration, of validation or provocation that might take root in a surprising and unforeseeable way in the mind of another, and one day bear fruit of its own.